4 years ago, my Aunt Rita, her actually maiden name was Rita Lewis, she died. My grandmother, though, her sister, didn't know until a month later because Aunt Rita's sister did not tell my grandmother that her last surviving sister died because she was passing for white. Aunt Rita's daughter, married to a white man. She's black, she's passing for white. Their kids, they don't know that they're black because they're living an actual white existence right now in Louisiana. I've never met them because clearly I ain't white. And so this whole notion of passing for white is not something that is old, it's still new. We talk about light skin, we talk about paper bag tests. It spoke to the issue back in the day of folks wanting to live a life free of Jim Crow. And there's a new book out. It is called A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life. Allyson Hobbs is the author. She's an assistant professor. Allyson, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
I mean, this, again, I know this. My Aunt Rita, when she would come to visit my grandmother, she would call her from payphones. It was a secret deal. And in fact, she was married to a guy who was a racist. And my uncle Roy, he told her, he said, Rita, you better not die before he dies, because when we show up, he gonna throw you the hell out the casket.
Right. That was very common. It was very, very common that people had to separate from their families if they decided to pass, that if someone were to die, that they would not let the family know that this person had died. Often people would find out, just as in your case, a month or more later. Sometimes they wouldn't find out until they read an obituary in a newspaper. And that was exactly the case, that they were terrified that black relatives would show up at the funeral and would destroy this image of whiteness that the family had so carefully protected. There's a really famous story of a woman named Elsie Roxborough who was from Detroit, and she passed as white. She ended up committing suicide in New York City, and her sister, who also looked white, traveled to claim her body because, again, they wanted her to be able to still be white even in death.
Who was the guy who worked at the New York Times?
Anatole Broyard.
Right.
Right, yes, exactly. So on his deathbed, he tells his children and lets them know that he's actually black and that he's been passing for white for years.
In fact, I'm pulling up, pull up an image of him. This is a small image of him. I'm pulling it up, but same thing. I mean, here's a guy. I mean, so this guy, all these years, he was passing, and now all of a sudden,
he's white. And supposedly when his son found out, he said, oh, that's cool. You know, sort of like, oh, I'm half black. How interesting, how cool. But Anatole Broyard is an interesting story because it was more of an open secret in a sense. He had been married to a black woman. People knew him as being black earlier in his life. And then it was later that he married a white woman and had children. So he's a really kind of fascinating story. And he leaves us with this question of why did he decide to pass later on? I think he dies in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
And the question is, you know, what did he feel that he was still gaining by passing as white?
Any prominent folks that you detail in the book who passed for white and we would be shocked by it?
You know, I try in my book to look at sort of everyday people who passed as white. So I don't have a lot of sort of like exposés of people who we know to be white who were actually black. But certainly, you know, we always hear these stories about how Obama is not the first black president and that there were other presidents who had, you know, some black blood, which is the way that that race was identified in the past through blood quantum. But most of the people in my book are lesser known figures. I was really interested in looking at the lived experience of passing and looking at what it was like for everyday people to pass.
Pull up Walter White. Walter
Yes.
White, well, of course, was one of the leaders of the NAACP.
Right.
No, folks, it's and so it's interesting about him
Yes.
because he actually, when he would travel south,
Right.
he would actually passed for white, and he used that to gain information for the NAACP.
Absolutely. He would investigate lynching. So he was very interested in exposing the crime of lynching. So he would travel to the South. He would sort of get to know the people who were involved in the lynching, and then he would travel back to the North and write articles and discuss this rampant crime. And there's a great story about Walter White where he's sitting on a train and a white man sits down next to him and he says, you know, I can identify these black people who pass as white. I know how to identify them. And he takes Walter White's hand into his and he says, see, if you were black, I'll use the polite word. Obviously, this man did not call him black, but he said, if you were black, I'd be able to tell by the half moons on your fingernails. So there was this sort of mythology about the signs of race, and one of them being that there was like a bluish tinge on the fingernails that would give someone away.
Folks, the book is A Chosen Exile, A History of Racial Passing in American Life. Allyson Hobbs, we certainly appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Folks, this is News One Now, TV One.